Thank you for being here this morning. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your many blessings, including the blessing of St. Luke's. Be with us as we study today this faithful Christian and wonderful apologist. In Christ's name, amen. So today, Rich had to be somewhere else, and they asked me if I would talk about anything I wanted to. Well, one of my favorite subjects is C.S. Lewis. So I thought I would talk to you today about C.S. Lewis, kind of give you an overview of his life, a little bit about who he was, and in particular what he wrote about that is something that you almost hear him quoted every Sunday in an Episcopal church somewhere. So let's dig into Clive Staples Lewis, who was born in 1898 in Belfast. And several years ago, Christianity Today asked more than 100 of its contributors and church leaders to nominate the 10 best religious books of the 20th century. And they said by best books, we meant those that not only were important when first published, but also have enduring significance for the Christian faith and church. And this is what they said as a result of that inquiry. By far, C.S. Lewis was the most popular author, and Mere Christianity, the book nominated most often. Indeed, we could have included even more of Lewis's works, but finally we had to say, enough is enough, give some other authors a chance. Lewis was an amazing person. During his lifetime, he spent his career as an English professor in England, but he wrote about English literary criticism, he wrote Christian apologetics, essays, sermons, science fiction, fantasy, children's novels, theology, philosophy, poetry, literary theory, autobiography, fiction, and allegory. So he was an incredibly prolific writer. And this is at a time when he did everything by hand wrote it out, no computers, no typewriters. He did everything by hand. And he's quoted everywhere in the Christian world. One of my favorites is, this kind of sums up Lewis's Christian faith and his view of life. He said, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And that's critical to an understanding of Lewis, because his faith wasn't just something he talked about, it was something he lived. And it, as we will see, it shaped everything he did. So Lewis, as I said, was born in Belfast in 1898. He had one brother, Warren, and he lived in a place called Little Lee, he had a very happy childhood. His mother and father were very doting, especially his mother. And for whatever reason, when he was 4 years old, he announced to his family that instead of being named Clive, his name was going to be Jacksy. And later, his friends shortened that to Jack, and he was known by his friends for the rest of his life as Jack Lewis. His brother was, when he grew up and continued throughout his life, his best friend. And then tragedy hit. In 1908, his mother died suddenly, and Lewis was about 9 years old, and it devastated him because she had been the person who took care of them. Their father, like many fathers at that time, he was distant, he was focused on his work, and so Lewis lost the best person in his life who took care of him. And his father never really recovered from that, and so he began to send Lewis to a series of boarding schools. And he went to one school called Windward, and in England, what they call a public school is actually what we would call a private school. So if you hear someone in England saying they went to public school, it actually is a private institution. But he went to this school, and he talks about in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, that there was brutal culture in many of the public schools called fagging, which was like we would call hazing in a fraternity. And on top of that, he not only got hazed by his fellow students, but the headmaster was brutal, and he beat the kids. He was really, later I think he went to a mental institution, but it was a really traumatic time because now Lewis had not only lost his mother, but he was in this environment which was so cruel. He went to a series of schools, dropping back and forth. His father kind of really had dropped out of his life other than paying for the school. And over time, Lewis says he became an atheist, and it said, dropping my faith with no sense of loss, but with the greatest relief. I began to labor very hard to make myself into a fop, a cad, and a snob. But during his youth and teen years, he also experienced a very unusual feeling that he called joy, and he would come back to the concept of joy many times in his life. And he also became enamored of the northern myths, very bleak, the Norse myths and others, very bleak, very stark, a lot about good and evil. And he really, for the rest of his life, was enamored of that, and you see those influences in his writing. Well, in 1914, his life took a great turn because his father sent him to a private tutor. His name was W.T. Kirkpatrick. He was known as the Great Knock. And when Lewis got off the train and Kirkpatrick met him at the train, it was in Surrey, and Lewis turned to Kirkpatrick and said that the Surrey landscape was wilder than he thought. Well, Lewis had just met this man, and he immediately lit into him. What do you mean by wilder? What's your comparison? How do you know? And that stuck with Lewis the rest of his life because Kirkpatrick always focused on logic and common sense. And the irony is that the training he received from Kirkpatrick later informed his ability in Mere Christianity and other apologetic writings to make his faith clear because he had developed this sense of logic and how do you take an argument to its logical extreme based on that. The other thing, he had already become an atheist, but the other thing was Kirkpatrick was also an ardent atheist. So all that did was reinforce in Lewis that there was no God. But he read a book then by George MacDonald called Fantast, and it showed a spiritual world that somehow resonated with Lewis, even though he couldn't explain why. Then in 1916, he gets admitted to Oxford University. He is a brilliant scholar. There are a lot of tales about his memory. He had a prodigious memory. One person told me that supposedly when he taught class in his rooms, he would tell a student, pick any book out and start reading. And that when they did that, he would start finishing the next sentence. He had an incredible memory, and he read everything there was to read. He was really a prodigious scholar. But he was hopeless in math. So here was this brilliant man who couldn't do math. And at that time, Oxford required you to pass math in order to graduate. And so he was very worried about whether he could pass. Then in 1917, when World War I came out, he was drafted and sent to the front. The interesting thing is, because he was a student, he could have avoided service, but he did not. And that speaks to his sense of duty, which defined him throughout his life, his sense of responsibility to others. And so he went and served, and he was badly wounded in 1918 and sent home. Before he went to the war, he had his best friend named Patty Moore. And the two of them made a pact that if something happened to one of them, the other one would take care of their parents. And so Patty Moore was killed in World War I, and that came back to play an important role in Lewis's life. So he returned to Oxford after the war, and because he had been in the war, they told him he did not have to pass math to graduate. So he got a degree in Greek and Latin literature in 1920. Then he went on and got a second degree in what's called Greats, which is kind of a combination of philosophy and ancient history, because by then he knew he wanted to be a professor. Around 1920, Patty Moore's mother she moved with her daughter to Oxford, and Lewis thought it was his duty to watch after her. And so he not only now continued his studies, but now he had a mother and daughter to take care of. He got a double first in English essay, but he had difficulty. He wanted to teach classics and philosophy, but he had difficulty finding a job. So he stayed in school. His father supported him. And finally, in 1925, Magdalen College, Oxford, it asked him to be an English professor. So this is Lewis as a young man, about the time he was entering college. And this is Magdalen College. Magdalen was founded in 1458. The tower you see there was built in 1492. And if any of you have ever been to Swanee, Breslin Tower in Swanee is modeled after this tower. So Lewis, when he started teaching at Magdalen, moved into what's called new buildings. The building on the right is called New Buildings at Magdalen. They were built in 1740. And he became a tutor and writer back then. And the way the Oxford system works is you had 3 years to get your degree. You only studied one subject. So once you got to school at Oxford or Cambridge in England, you already had decided what you were going to study, whether it was English, philosophy, history, economics, and you only studied that one subject. You only had one set of exams at the end of the 3 years, and that determined your entire grade for college. So you can imagine the pressure that's on those students. He tutored a number of students, and the way the tutoring system worked there is a student would be given an assignment, and they would read during the week that assignment and write a paper, and then they would come to the tutor. Most of this was, at that time, was one-on-one. Occasionally there would be several students, but most of it was one-on-one, which is the great system that Oxford had developed. And so his students would come in, read their paper, and he would critique them. And apparently he smoked a pipe, and they said you could hardly see him because of all the smoke. But because of his intellect, he was also pretty devastating in his critiques. So he was both feared and idolized because of his professorship. He also was a lecturer, and the other thing at Oxford is you do the one-on-one tutorials, then there are a set of lectures in your field that are optional, but you know that if you don't go to those lectures, you're going to be tested on them at the end of the 3 years. So he quite quickly became one of the most popular lecturers in Oxford, and a lot of people who weren't studying English would still come here as lecturers because they were so brilliant. Apparently, most of his lectures were without any notes at all. He would walk up, start talking, and do a magnificent job. A fairly new book about his time as a teacher and lecturer is by Simon Horobin, who I got to meet this summer at Magdalen. He's also an English professor, and because he's not only an English professor, but because he's at Magdalen, he got access to a lot of their archives that other scholars had not gotten. So he wrote a book about what Lewis's life was like as a teacher and scholar. Also at Oxford, he came to know several great other professors or others, some lawyers, who became not only his good friends, but they formed a group called the Inklings. And the Inklings met once a week, sometimes at a pub, sometimes in one of their rooms or Lewis's rooms. Some of the Inklings, you of course will recognize J.R.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield, Neville Coghill, Charles Williams, his brother Warren, and Hugo Dyson. And they would discuss everything under the sun. They often met at the Eagle and Child in Oxford, which was colloquially known as the Bird and the Baby Pub. And if you go there today, there's a plaque showing where they would sit and meet. But they would discuss everything under the sun, not just literature, not just academics, but gossip as well. But they also read each other's works. And that's where Tolkien began to read his draft of The Lord of the Rings. And Lewis later said that he thought Lord of the Rings was one of the most unique pieces of literature he had ever read. Lewis also, think of this, he knew French, Greek, Latin, Italian, Anglo-Saxon, German, Norse, and Old and Middle English. So he not only knew these languages, but he read the books in the original language. So he was an incredible scholar. Some interesting things about him. He never learned to drive. He always had to either take a bus or train or have somebody ride him. He didn't read newspapers. He wrote everything, as I said, in longhand. And we'll come back to his letter writing. But also, he began this strange relationship with Mrs. Moore, and nobody really knows what all that entailed, but it was just a bizarre time in his life. And in 1930, he bought this house in Headington Quarry called the Kilns, and the Kilns is still there today if you want to go see what it's like. It's a nice but very modest house, and part of that is because Lewis later, because of his writings, made a lot of money, and he gave it all away. He didn't tell people that, but he just gave it all the way away. So he continued to live a very modest life. At one point, Horribin talks about Lewis was named the president of the college by the other fellows, but he didn't last long because he was very disorganized. He had no head for accounting, and they finally came to him and said, "This is not the job for you," and got him out of that. He also, interestingly, was not really concerned with academic politics, and that in a place like Oxford, like a lot of educational institutions, there was a lot of backbiting, a lot of intrigue, a lot of jealousy, and as he became a Christian, he put all that aside. So let's move along to Christianity. He kept being nagged by God. Even though he was an atheist, he kept being nagged. And as I said, he had this sense of joy, which he described in a sermon. Joy is desire for our own far-off country, the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never visited. And so he had this sense that there was another world that he couldn't access, but it seemed real to him. And then he had a series of experiences. So in about 1926, he was visiting another professor who was a very vocal and ardent atheist. And they were talking, and they got on the subject of the myth of the dying God, which echoes in a lot of different genres. And they were talking about it, and this ardent atheist said to Lewis, "Rum thing, it looks like it really happened once." And this blew Lewis away to think that this ardent atheist began to talk about as if the resurrection had actually happened. And so as he says in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, he began to really examine his life, and this is what he said he found. For the first time, I examined myself with a seriously practical purpose, and there I found what appalled me: a zoo of lust, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion. And so that did not paint for him a pretty picture of himself, because he had been pretty prideful, pretty self-sufficient, arrogant, I think he would say. And suddenly he began to see that that was not the full C.S. Lewis. And so he begins his journey, and in 1929 he says that he got on his knees at Magdalen and prayed and accepted God, and he says that that night I was the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. But at that point, he's not a Christian, he's just a theist. He's finally accepted the notion that there is some kind of God, but he hasn't decided what that God is like. So then, a couple of years later, Hugo Dyson and J.R. Tolkien come to his room one night, and they start talking about the Christian faith, and the talk lasts all night. At one point, they take a walk along Addison's Walk, which is on the side of Magdalen and goes around a stream, and it's a beautiful little pathway. They take a walk on that. And what Tolkien says to Lewis that finally turns the light bulb on, he says, I know you think all this is a myth, and there are a lot of myths out there, but what if Christianity is the one true myth? What if all the other myths are echoes of Christianity, but that Christianity is actually the one true myth? And that something snaps in Lewis, and he begins to say, this is the real myth. This is the truth. And he talks about the central miracle asserted by Christians is the incarnation. He says, if God became man, if it really happened, it's the central event in the history of the earth, the very thing that the whole story has been about. And he talks about, his mind's really in turmoil now, and he talks about he takes a motorcycle ride in the side cart, because he didn't drive, to the zoo. And he says, on the way to the zoo, I didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ, and on the way back, I had decided that Jesus was the Christ. And so from that point on, his life takes a drastic turn. He becomes humble. As I said, he gave away a lot of money, never telling people about it. And he began to study the Christian faith in earnest. And think about this, he already had this incredible background of all the myths, literature from all over the world, all different genres. So he had all of this in the background, which really fueled his faith. So then World War II happens, and Lewis volunteers for the Army, even though he's way too old, but he volunteers because, again, of that sense of duty. And he's turned down, so he joins the Home Guard at home because he feels like he needs to be a part. Well, then the BBC comes to Lewis, and as you can imagine, 1940 is a very dark period in English history, and they wanted somebody to help encourage the British people, so they came to Lewis, and he did a series of broadcast talks on the BBC. The first series was called Broadcast Talks in 1942, Christian Behavior in 1943, and Beyond Personality in 1944. Almost none of his radio broadcasts have been preserved, but here's one, if we can get this to play.
In these talks, I've had to say a good deal about prayer. And before going on to my main subject tonight, I'd like to deal with a difficulty some people find about the whole idea of prayer. Somebody put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of him listening to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I find quite a lot of people feel that difficulty. Well, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, at the same moment. Most of us can imagine a God attending to any number of claimants if only they come one by one, and he has an endless time to do it in. So what's really at the back of the difficulty is this idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time.
So he gave those talks, and he was, during World War II, he was the second most recognizable voice in England behind that of Winston Churchill. After the war, he was encouraged to turn those talks into a book, which he did, and he turned those into what we now know as Mere Christianity. It was extremely popular. A personal note, Mere Christianity is the book that changed my life. A lot of people have said the same thing, and it's an incredible look at the Christian faith. And because of his ability to apply this extreme logic, he's able to explain things in a way that makes complex things understandable. He also gives a sermon in 1941 called The Weight of Glory. We don't have time to go into that now, but I urge you to Google that sermon. It's one of the greatest talks I've ever read. It's well known, and it really set him up to be known as a giver of sermons as well. Then in 1942, he comes up with another book called The Screwtape Letters, letters from a devil named Screwtape to his nephew Wormwood about how to tempt what they call the patient away from God. Many of you have read that. It's also an incredible book. And that book was so well received that in 1947, he was on the cover of Time magazine. Now, you've got to understand, this is a fairly obscure English professor in England who suddenly is on the cover of Time magazine in the United States. It's really remarkable. He also wrote a series of books some of you have heard of called the Narnia series. Kelly and I happened to have an opportunity this summer to see in Magdalen College. These are all first editions of the Narnia series. This is some of the illustrations that are in the original series. They're absolutely beautiful. Well, I talked about how the Christian faith changed him. He became very humble. He gave away a lot of money, but also it hurt his academic career because there was a lot of jealousy among the Oxford professors about why this so-called academic was writing popular books. That was looked down on, and the fact he was a Christian when most of them weren't was looked down on. And Lewis gave up a lot in his career because of his Christian faith. And so there was a prestigious chair in Oxford that everyone thought he deserved, the Merton Chair of English, but he never got it because of this jealousy. And so in 1954, this is again Magdalen, but spelled Magdalene. Magdalen College, Cambridge, calls him and gives him their chair of medieval and Renaissance literature. And so he leaves Oxford to teach for the rest of his time at Cambridge, although he keeps his house at the Kilns. So every Monday he got on a train and went to Cambridge. Every Friday he got on the train and came back and spent the weekend at the Kilns. His brother Warney lived with him, and so that was sort of their existence. He also started, when he became a Christian, started attending a church near his home called Holy Trinity Church. You can see the church today. And He didn't particularly like hymns. He didn't particularly like some of the things about the service, but he, again, thought it was his duty to attend church regularly, and he did. He also, particularly when he wrote Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters, he also was inundated with letters. And Lewis thought that it was his duty, if someone had taken time to write him a letter, it was his duty to write them back. So he wrote thousands of handwritten notes and letters to respond to all these people who wrote him. He also did other works of not only Narnia and Screwtape, but a number of other books. Some of you are listening right now to David Hall, who's doing a series on the Great Divorce. That's my Lenten discipline. Thank you, David. And so he wrote a number of other books. And people have gone into what was his motivation? Why did he give up this chance to have this prestigious career? And why did he spend so much time responding to letters, writing these books? It's because he came to see that the world was a supernatural world. He was very orthodox. He believed in the virgin birth. He believed there were miracles. He wrote a book called Miracles. And he believed in the bodily resurrection of Christ. And he began to see that, in his view, Christianity was the truth, not a truth, but the truth. And he said that other religions had elements of the truth, but only Christianity had the final truth. And he said that Christianity is a religion you could not have guessed. He also believed the devil was real, which he shows in Screwtape and other books. And he believed that there was a heaven and hell, although if you read The Great Divorce, he's not as hellfire and damnation as a lot of people. He really thought that God gave everybody every chance, and that ultimately God said to them, if you don't want to do my will, then your will be done. And so hell was basically your own choice. In that sermon, The Weight of Glory, he says this: there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting spears. And our charity must be real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins, in spite of which we love the sinner. And that so encapsulates his deep motivation, that he wanted people to see Christianity as the truth, and he wanted them to understand the ramifications. Then another amazing thing happens to him. He starts getting letters from a woman in America. Her name was Joy Davidman. She was Jewish. She had been a communist. She had been an atheist, but she also had a brilliant mind. And she started writing Lewis letters, and he found them so intriguing, like everybody else. He started writing her back, and they set up this correspondence, which really took off in a way that a lot of his correspondence had not. And so they agreed to meet. She's coming to England with her. She's got 2 boys. She's coming to England, and so she asks if they could meet. And so Lewis and his brother go to the Randolph Hotel to have tea and meet this woman. That's another picture of Joy Davidman. And she was the first person that Lewis really began to see. Not only was she intellectually interesting, but she had an intellect that could stay up with his. And so she was she had a lot of satire. She was very brilliant. They could discuss things in a way that Lewis had rarely been able to discuss them with people. And she became converted to Christianity by reading his books. She was married to a man named William Gresham. And so she comes and meets Lewis. Lewis really enjoys meeting her, but he thinks that's it. I'm done with her. I've met her. But then she comes back to England after she gets divorced. And when she had the first trip to England, when she got back, she found that her husband was living with another woman. So she divorces him. She moves back to England to get away and bring her sons with her. And so she and Lewis start a relationship again. There are a couple of movies about this. There's also a play called Shadowlands. One is with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger, and one is with Josh Ackland and Claire Bloom. They're excellent movies. And he begins to have a relationship with her, but he still thinks it's very platonic. He's not interested in marriage. It doesn't even cross his mind. But then England says that they're going to deport her because her visa has expired. And so Lewis agrees to marry her in a civil ceremony, not a religious ceremony, but a civil ceremony, so she can claim that she's a British citizen and she can stay in England. And they do that, and they still live apart, so she still keeps living in her house, he keeps living in his house, and they go on for a while about this. They have a friendship, but no marriage in the sense we think of it. But then in early 1957, she gets cancer. And they think she's going to die then. Lewis then realizes that he's in love with her. And it took the cancer to do it, but he realizes he's in love with her. Several Anglican priests refused to marry them because she was a divorcee. But he finds an Anglican priest he knows who says, "Of course I'll marry you." And they get married at her bedside in Churchill Hospital. And at that point, Lewis has married her, and they're thinking she's about to die. Then she has a miraculous recovery. And for several years, she's cancer-free. They take Lewis, who didn't really travel much, but they take a trip to Greece, which is something that he talks about a lot after that. But then her cancer recurs, and as she's dying, she says to Lewis, "You have made me happy. I am at peace with God." Lewis himself was devastated. Here he was, he'd been a bachelor his whole life, finally found the woman he loved, and then she's taken away, and he's angry at God. He starts questioning his faith. He writes a book called A Grief Observed, but he does it under a pseudonym, so he says the author is N.W. Clerk, and only later does it come out that he's actually the author. And he says, "When I was a boy, I chose safety. When I became a man, I chose suffering." Many of you know Birmingham Patty Callahan Henry. She lives here in Birmingham. She's an author. She wrote a book several years ago called Becoming Mrs. Lewis, where she envisions almost all the correspondence between Lewis and Joy was destroyed because they didn't want anybody to ever read them. But what Patty did is she envisioned what these letters would have been like, and through that she tells the story of their relationship. By 1963, Lewis is becoming ill. He has a heart attack and recovers from that, but he's becoming increasingly in poor health. This is him near the end of his life at his house in the Kilns. His brother Warnie is living with him, and he tells Warnie shortly before he dies, I have done what I came to do. I'm ready to see God." And he dies on a date you may remember, November 22nd, 1963. So he dies on the same day that John F. Kennedy is assassinated. And because of that, his death is almost not noticed anywhere. And very few people know that he's actually died. It was one week short of his 65th birthday. So he's buried in that little church in Headington, Holy Trinity. He's buried, and on his tombstone, his brother had written, men must endure their going hence, which is a phrase from King Lear, but it was a quotation on Lewis's father's calendar on the day his mother died. And so they tied all that together with that quotation. I saw this summer. I'd never seen it before. This is a bust of Lewis at Magdalen College. The bust was made by Tolkien's daughter-in-law, which I think is fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about the ramifications of Lewis and his faith. There's a marvelous book by Armin Nicolai, who taught psychiatry at Harvard, but also was a Christian. He wrote this book on Freud and Lewis, and he kind of compared Lewis's life and Freud's life. And one of the interesting things to me is that Freud was haunted by the notion of God his entire life. He wrote about it all the time, although he remained an atheist. And here's where your worldview makes all the difference in the world, because as Freud gets sick, he's in total despair because he believes that's the end of everything. And near the end of his life, he commits suicide. Lewis, on the other hand, knows he's going to die, and he says, I'm at peace with God, and I've done what I came to do. So this is one of the other few audios we have. This is from his book, Mere Christianity, and this sums up, I think, a lot about what Mere Christianity is trying to say.
Because the very first step towards getting a real self is to forget about the self. It will come only if you're looking for something else. Give up yourself and you will find your real self. Lose your life and you will save it. Submit to death, submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Look for Christ and you will get him, and with him everything else thrown in. Look for yourself and you will get only hatred, loneliness, despair, and ruin.
So that's a great summary of Lewis's faith, his motivation, and why he spent so much of his life promulgating the Christian faith. I really appreciate all of you being here, and certainly glad to answer any questions you might have. His father must have been wealthy to help him through the schools until he was, 25 or 6, and he started making his own wealth? Yeah, his father had enough means to provide for him throughout that, and I think as time went on, his father realized what he had done to Lewis by sending him to these schools. And so I'm not sure I would say out of guilt, but he continued to support Lewis during his time in Oxford before he got hired. Could you just repeat the questions? Sure. Did he identify as an Anglican, or did he just identify sort of globally as a Christian? He identified as an Anglican. That was the church that was the Church of England. That was the church he went to. Like I said, he didn't particularly like hymns. He didn't like other things about the Anglican service, but he thought that was the Church of England, and he was going to be a part of that. Did he have a sense of humor? He had a tremendous. Did he have a sense of humor? He had a tremendous sense of humor. That was one of the things he was known about. He was known for his loud and deep laugh. He was known for how witty he was. That's part of what the Inklings did, was they went back and forth with their wit, and he was known to be incredibly funny. He has the two sons of Joy Gresham. Does he have any living relatives? The two sons of Joy Gresham are still living. One of them, I think, is Douglas, kind of runs the C.S. Lewis estate. The other one has just disappeared from life. Apparently, he didn't want to have anything to do with all this. So he just kind of exited the scene, and I don't really know what happened to him. But his other stepson, runs his estate. And the stepson is somebody that Patty Callahan Henry met with while she was working on this book, and he gave her a lot of assistance. I did some research because I had been told there were no recordings left, but I did some research and just came across there are only those very few. The ones I played are some of the only recordings they have of his talks. Mrs. Moore. Mrs. Moore eventually passed away, and I'm not sure exactly what happened to the daughter because once she became of age, she moved out, and I don't really know what happened to her after that. There's not a lot of mention of she and Lewis staying in touch. They may have, but kind of once Mrs. Moore dies, they both kind of just disappear from the scene. Well, thank you. Oh, Bill. Yes, sir. Yeah, like I said, during the war, he was the second most recognizable voice. So people began to realize his contribution to the war effort through his talks that then turned into Mere Christianity. One of the primary reasons he got on time, though, was Screwtape Letters. It was such a unique book, and it just took off in popularity. And that's what got everybody's attention. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone coming today.